Intruder on Halloween. The clock ticks softly, its sound nearly drowned out by the eerie music playing on the TV. Colorful costumes and decorations adorn the walls, remnants of the Halloween festival. Tonight, like every year, I was going trick or treating with my best friend, Casey. Excitement filled the air as we stuffed our bags with candy, the weight of our haul increasing after each house we visited. The streets were filled with laughter and the sound of children running from house to house. As we walked, we noticed a man standing near a lamppost. He wore a mask and held a flickering lantern. His eyes seemed to follow us as we passed by, sending a chill down my spine. I glanced at Casey, and we quickened our pace. We continued our journey, laughing and screaming as we collected treats, but occasionally, I caught a glimpse of the masked man lingering just out of reach. It felt like he was watching us. At one house, while we were busy stuffing our bags, I turned around and saw him standing on the street, intently watching us. I yelled at Casey to get away, that we needed to run fast from there. We hurried to the front door of the house we were at and knocked frantically. The homeowner opened the door. We explained that there was a scary man outside. The couple looked worried and ushered us inside for safety as the masked man moved further down the street. After a few minutes, we saw the masked man had left, and we thought we could leave the house now. Just as we thought we had escaped, I spotted him hiding behind a tree, waving at us. Panic flooded me. He only backed away when an adult threatened to call the police. After walking a few more blocks, we crossed a small wooden bridge over the river. The night air was fresh and cool, but a sense of unease washed over me as a black Jeep stopped on the other side. The driver leaned out the window. A spooky man wearing a pumpkin mask called out to us in a gravelly voice. "We need directions," he shouted. I felt a bit suspicious and distrustful of this man, so I declined and we kept moving. The Jeep couldn't cross the bridge, so we had to drive away. But just when we thought we were safe, a long time later, an SUV screeched around the corner of the bridge and stopped right in front of us. The window rolled down, revealing a man who was probably someone else, but he was also wearing the same mask. Then he said, "Get in the car, and they have free bags of candy," the man shouted, his voice filled with manipulation. My heart raced as I glanced at Casey. We turned back to running when I heard the car roar again. The man started to get out of the car. We just ran as fast as we could to the house because we were almost home. We finally arrived home. My mother left for work, so it was just the two of us at home. Tonight, Casey slept at my house to stay safe. Every second passed as I looked out the window uneasily at that man in the pumpkin mask. The memory of the Jeep, everything was still in my mind. Mine. The streets were pitch black, darkness stretching over the sidewalk. I held my phone, staring at the screen, hoping to distract myself from the rising anxiety within. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. A message from Casey. What if they come back? I glanced at her, but she was still peacefully asleep, unaware of the tension suffocating the room. I cautiously approached the window and peered through the curtains. My heart skipped a beat. The black Jeep was parked outside my house. I whispered urgently, shaking Casey awake. Casey's eyes flew open in fear. We both sat up, listening intently. The engine roared, and I could see a shadow moving inside the Jeep. My pulse quickened, and I knew we had to act and come up with a plan. I whispered, "If he comes in, we have to trap that man." We gathered supplies, a heavy chair, some rope from my dad's toolbox, and my phone, so I could call for help if needed. We figured we could block the door if he came in, trapping him inside. Casey nodded, and we hurriedly propped the chair against the door, tying it tightly with the rope. We were ready and positioned behind the chair, preparing for anything that might happen. Through the glass, I saw the masked man standing by the front door, his shadow ominously stretching. My heart raced as he knocked, the sound echoing like thunder in the silence of the night. Suddenly, I saw the man step back, turn around and walk towards the Jeep. I watched in horror as another figure stepped out of the car, both wearing masks and dark clothes. My mind is racing now. There are two people, I whispered. Fumbling for my phone, Casey, we need to call the police. Fear gripped me, knowing our trap might only buy us a little time to escape safely. But before I could dial, I heard footsteps approaching the house. The doorknob rattled, and my heart raced. The masked man yelled something indistinct, and I felt panic rise. They're trying to get in, I said, gripping Casey's arm tightly. I heard them banging on the door, trying to break it down. The chair held for now, but I knew it wouldn't last long. Call the police, I shouted, but Casey was frozen in fear, her eyes wide. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I whispered, we need to run, and when they break in, Casey and I will head for the back door. With a loud crash, the chair toppled over. The door swung open. The masked man charged into the living room, followed by another figure. I slowly crawled toward the door, then grabbed Casey's hand, and we ran toward the back door, quietly escaping the intruders. We bolted out into the backyard and ran toward the fence. Behind us, I heard the men shouting. I shouted for Casey to climb over the fence. I thought we still had hope and needed to seize this chance to try to get over. As things grew urgent, I started to climb up, but unfortunately for me, one of them came outside and managed to grab and pull my leg. I flailed and kicked at his face, but it didn't seem to matter. It didn't faze him at all. I fell painfully to the ground. I looked in agony as Casey cried in fear by the fence on the other side. I screamed for her to run. I would follow, but she seemed too scared, worried for my safety. I lay in pain, watching him grin grotesquely. He taunted me, saying trick or treat, and waved at Casey playfully, enjoying our fear. I reassured myself that I needed to escape and survive. I slowly, secretly grabbed the ice and stood up to answer his question as if I was pretending to play with him. I took candy out of my pocket and said I wouldn't run away. I asked if he wanted a piece of candy. He seemed surprised and didn't notice as I threw the rock at his face. He fell, screaming in pain, and his friend came out from the house, witnessing it. He also yelled in anger. I didn't think much, trying to use the remaining strength to climb over the fence to escape. Just as we were about to escape, I heard the distant sound of a siren. I felt relieved. The police were coming. I headed toward the front yard to meet them. When we reached the front yard, the flashing lights of the police car lit up the street. The officers ran toward us, and I pointed at the men trying to flee back to the Jeep. "They're over there," I shouted, and the police sprang into action, chasing after them. Within minutes, the police had apprehended the masked men. Back inside the house, my mom rushed in, just returning home. She pulled us into a tight hug, relief evident on her face. Casey and I exchanged glances. We were finally safe. My mom made us a cup of hot cocoa, and as I took a sip, I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly everything had turned from a night of fear to a sense of safety. I said, glancing at Casey, "Maybe Halloween isn't so bad after all." Run away from the stalker. It was one of those summer nights where the air was still, and everything seemed eerily quiet. The large, suburban house, with its perfectly trimmed lawn, stood imposingly. Inside, Chase and I had no idea of the terror about to unfold. I was 15 at the time, hanging out at my friend Chase's house. His parents were out, and we were home alone. The basement was every kid's dream. A TV, a pool table, video games. It was the kind of place that made you forget the world outside, and we were living the dream. We lounged on a big leather couch, watching a horror movie on TV, munching on chips. Chase had started to doze off. I was struggling with my own unease, the kind of anxiety I often felt when sleeping over at a friend's house. But tonight, it felt different. It was much worse. It must have been past midnight when I heard it. A door creaking open slowly. I glanced over the back of the couch and saw something unsettling. The laundry room door in the basement was wide open. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my mind, maybe just the wind, but I knew better. I quickly shook Chase awake. Chase, wake up. The laundry room door. It opened by itself. Chase, groggy and half asleep, mumbled something about it happening all the time and told me to go back to sleep. He didn't seem panicked, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling crawling down my spine. I insisted that we go close it together. We both got up and cautiously shut the door. Chase flopped back onto the couch, falling asleep within minutes. I tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. A while later, I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't a sound that startled me. Standing behind the couch, looking down at us, was a man. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The man was pale, sickly looking, with sunken eyes and an expression that was deeply unsettling. He stood there, motionless, just staring at us. I screamed, a sound that shattered the stillness of the night. Chase jolted awake, his eyes wide with horror as he saw the man advancing toward us. In our panic, we ran. The basement had two exits, one leading upstairs to the front door, the other to a sliding door at the patio. In our terror, we split up. I ran for the patio while Chase bolted up the stairs. Gasping for breath, I quickly called the police, shouting out the address and frantically explaining that someone had broken into the house. But Chase, I couldn't leave him behind. I circled the house, sneaking back in through the same door I had used to escape. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I knew I had to find Chase. I moved as quietly as I could, climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. The house was massive, and the silence was suffocating. Then I heard it, Chase's voice. His scream, a desperate, terrified scream for help. I bolted up the stairs, my legs trembling. At the top of the stairs, I saw the man, the intruder, wrapping his hands around Chase's neck, choking him, his face twisted in a grotesque expression. Chase's eyes were wide, his face flushed as he struggled to breathe. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a heavy sports trophy from Chase's room. Without thinking, I charged at the man. I swung the trophy with all my strength, smashing it into the back of the intruder's head. The man collapsed to the floor, and Chase fell with him, gasping for air, but alive. We didn't wait. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached Chase's treehouse. There, we hid, waiting for the sound of sirens. Chase was still trembling, rubbing his neck where the man's hands had gripped him just minutes earlier. We sat in silence, too afraid to speak. I looked out through the small window in the treehouse, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. The house looked eerily still, as if nothing had ever happened. Chase whispered, "What do we do now?" I had no answer. All I knew was that I couldn't let him go back inside. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the direction of the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on grass. Then, I saw him, the man. He was slowly walking across the yard, his movements deliberate. His sunken eyes stared straight ahead, almost robotic, as he made his way toward the treehouse. I grabbed Chase's arm, pulling him away from the window. "He's coming," We both backed into the corner of the tiny treehouse, barely breathing. The man's footsteps grew louder. Now I could hear him, crunching on the gravel path leading to the treehouse ladder. The creaking of the ladder made me jump with fear. He was climbing. I could feel the weight of him pressing down on the structure as the treehouse swayed with each step. Chase looked at me, eyes wide with terror. I had to do something. I scanned the cramped space, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty toolbox Chase's dad had left there months ago. I grabbed a metal rod nearby, gripping it tightly in my trembling hands. The man's hand appeared at the edge of the treehouse entrance, his fingers curling around the wooden frame. I swung the rod down with all my strength. The man let out a groan of pain, lost his balance, and fell backward off the ladder. He hit the ground hard. I grabbed Chase, and we scrambled down, running as fast as we could toward the house. My mind raced. Where could we go? The man had fallen, but he wasn't dead, and I knew it wouldn't be long before he got up again. Panting, I pulled Chase toward the side of the house, where thick bushes and overgrown trees hid us from view. We crouched down, trying to catch our breath. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, the sound of tires crunching on gravel. It was the police. I whispered to Chase to wave for help. We stood cautiously, peering around the bushes. The man was nowhere to be seen. I signaled to Chase to follow me. We darted toward the driveway as the police car came to a stop. Relief washed over me as two officers stepped out, immediately scanning the area. I shouted, "He's still here!" "He's..." Before I could finish, a man emerged from the shadows, appearing from the side of the house. His movements were slower, more deliberate. Blood dripped from a gash on his head. The officers drew their weapons, ordering him to stop. But he didn't listen. He kept walking toward us, his eyes locked on Chase and me. The man ignored them, continuing his slow, deliberate walk. And then, without warning, he charged at us in a terrifying sprint. A gunshot from the police tore through the night. The man staggered, collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath. A wave of numbness washed over me. It was finally over. That night, as Chase and I sat in the police station, I learned that the man was a drifter, living in abandoned houses across the city. He was mentally unstable, with a history of violent behavior. But the most chilling detail? In his pocket, they found a crumpled old photograph. It was of Chase's house. The man had been watching us for a long time. Chase and I stood outside the police station, waiting for our parents to arrive. The terror of the night still weighed heavily on us. It served as a reminder that real horror doesn't always come from the darkness. Sometimes it's standing right behind you, watching. The Clown in the Tree. This happened to me when I was 14. It was the same year everyone was talking about creepy clowns lurking in random places. The stories were everywhere, but I never took them seriously until I had an encounter of my own. I was sitting alone in the living room. My parents had gone to my grandparents' house for the evening, leaving me home by myself. But instead of feeling free, there was a strange unease I couldn't shake. I texted some friends, inviting them over to kill time John and Emma. We played video games for a while, but after a few hours, we got bored. John had an idea. He said, "Let's go into the woods." There was a forest right behind my house that we usually avoided, especially at night. But it was still light out, and with nothing else to do, I agreed. We gathered ourselves and headed out. Part of me regretted it as soon as we left the house. The forest was dense, tall trees casting cool shade, but we weren't scared. We joked around, tossed sticks, and laughed about nothing. We had been there for about 20 or 30 minutes when we heard something strange. Someone was crying. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like sobbing, desperate, coming from deep within the trees. We all stopped, staring at each other. John was the first to break the silence, whispering tensely, "What the hell is that?" None of us knew, and Emma suggested we go check it out. I wanted to say no, but before I could, everyone was already heading towards the sound. My heart started pounding harder with each step. Something felt wrong, like we were walking into a place we shouldn't. As we got closer, we saw a figure slumped on a large branch of an old tree. It was a man, dressed as a clown. His outfit was white with black polka dots, but it was stained and torn. He wore a black wig, but it was messy, and his makeup was smeared by what looked like tears. He just sat there, quietly crying. John, being the idiot he was, yelled, "Hey, you idiot! Why are you crying up there?" A chill ran down my spine, and I instantly turned to John, telling him to shut up. But it was too late. The clown looked down at us, his tear-streaked face twisting into a smile. His lips curled upward, but it was hollow, as if he was trying to express something through invisible pain. And then I saw it. His hand, gripping a large machete, the blade covered in what looked like blood. We were frozen. He just sat there, staring at us, his smile widening grotesquely, yet his eyes were cold, emotionless. He said, "You won't understand, but when I show you, you will." Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I screamed, "Run!" We scattered, running in all directions. My heart pounded, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted towards home. The forest seemed endless, branches scratching at my skin as I ran. I could hear the others screaming, their voices fading as we were separated. I reached the edge of the woods, sprinting into my backyard. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door behind me. Then, I waited for my friends. Emma made it back, panting and pale with fear. But John wasn't with us. We waited for him, hoping he'd burst through the door, laughing about how scared we were. But then we waited, and no one came. We called the police. They came and searched the forest. We told them everything: the clown, the machete, the crying. They didn't seem surprised. It turned out the man we saw was a local. He had been on the run for days. The police said he was a heavy drug user who had killed his wife and left her body wrapped in a white sheet. The next day, they found John. He was dead, discovered in a deep lake in the forest. The man must have chased him while the rest of us ran. I couldn't believe it. John was gone, just like that. And it was my fault for agreeing to go into that forest. If I hadn't, maybe he would still be alive. I told my parents everything, and they promised never to leave me home alone again. But it didn't help much. I couldn't sleep for weeks, and when I did, I had nightmares of the clown standing in the forest, smiling at me with his blood-stained machete. It's been 5 years since that night. I'm 19 now, but the memory of what happened in the forest is still burned into my mind. John's disappearance and the discovery of his body in the lake. It haunts me. No one ever talked about it after the police closed the case. A tragic accident, they said. A drug-crazed maniac. But I knew there was more to it. For years, I pushed the memories down, but recently, they've started to resurface. It began with nightmares, the image of the clown, his twisted smile. But lately, it's been more real, as if he's not just in my dreams anymore. Something is coming for me. I've started feeling like I'm being watched again, just like back then. And tonight, I swear I saw him, standing at the edge of the forest behind my house, staring at me. I grabbed a flashlight, pepper spray, and a taser. I don't even know what I was thinking, but I couldn't sit here, paralyzed by fear anymore. The only way to end this is to go back to where it all started. The air was thick with silence as I stepped outside. The the flashlight casting weak beams through the trees. The moment I entered the forest, each step felt heavier than the last, as if the woods themselves were pulling me deeper into the darkness. I didn't know where I was going, but my legs seemed to remember the way. Soon enough, I found myself back at the place where we had first seen the clown crying. Suddenly, the rustling of leaves shattered the silence. I froze. The sound of snapping twigs grew closer. I slowly turned around. The flashlight shook in my trembling hands, illuminating a figure perched on a branch, whistling. It was him. He looked just like before, his white clothes smeared with dirt and something darker dried blood. His black wig was still a tangled mess. He just sat there, staring, holding the machete. The clown tilted his head, his smile twisting even more as he jumped down effortlessly, walking slowly, deliberately toward me. He said, "Welcome back." I was so angry I almost cried, yelling that I knew what he had done to John. The clown's smile faded, replaced by a fake look of pity. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I didn't kill him. He chose it." I shook my head, backing away. His words. When I ran, I remembered seeing John hesitate, standing still. He didn't seem scared, more like mesmerized. And what he said before we ran into the woods, he looked sad, doesn't he? I snapped back to reality as the clown got closer, saying that when it was my turn, I'd understand. His words hit me like a punch. I stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen branch. The flashlight slipped from my hand, flickering as it rolled across the ground. Darkness enveloped me, and I reached to grab it, but the clown's footsteps were closer now. I looked up and saw him towering over me, raising the machete. I pulled the pepper spray from my pocket and sprayed it. He staggered for a moment. But then I heard a voice that sounded like John's. "Alex, you need to leave." I don't know how. I didn't look back at the clown. I just ran. His laughter echoed behind me. Suddenly, I was standing in my backyard, alone. The forest was quiet now, the house dark and still. I rushed inside and called the police, convinced he was still out there. When the police arrived this time, he was there. They found him crouched near the lake, clutching the machete. His clothes were soaked in blood and dirt. He didn't resist when they approached. Later, they interrogated him for hours. The clown believed he was chosen to lead people to the other side. The police dismissed it as the ramblings of a madman. But even then, I knew something darker was at play. The stalker in the Dunkin' Donuts parking lot. It was just an ordinary morning. My usual routine. A quick coffee stop at Dunkin' Donuts before heading to work. I don't go there every day, only when I feel like treating myself. Today, I decided to visit my usual spot. The store was busy, as expected, with the familiar noise of orders and chatter filling the space. I lined up, placed my order, and within minutes, I had my coffee in hand. As I stepped out of Dunkin', the sun was high, and the parking lot was crowded. People were rushing off to work, grabbing breakfast, nothing unusual, except for one thing. There was a man standing near my car. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, near the passenger seat, wearing a black coat, with his head slightly tilted as if listening to something. I tried not to think too much about it. People do weird things sometimes, right? Maybe he was just waiting for someone. I pressed the unlock button on my remote, the faint beep cutting through the quiet, and I headed for the driver's seat. The plan was simple. Get in, start the car, drive off, and forget about it. As soon as I got inside, an uneasy feeling ran down my spine. I put the key in the ignition, and just as I was about to start the car, the passenger door opened. The man got in. For a second, I just stared, frozen in disbelief. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, staring out the window. My heart raced. I didn't understand what was happening. I turned to him, my voice shaky. "I think you're in the wrong car." Silence. He didn't even acknowledge me. The tension was palpable. I said it again, louder this time. "You're in the wrong car." Still nothing. He just stared out the window, his expression blank, detached. That's when the fear set in. I told him to get out or I'd call the police. My voice was firmer now, desperate. And then it happened. Without warning, he turned toward me, glaring. His hand shot toward the ignition, and before I could react, he grabbed my keys. For a moment, he struggled. He held my keys in a tight grip, and before I knew what was happening, he swung at me, using the keys as a weapon. He swung it toward my face. I dodged, but I knew I had to get out of there. I pushed open the driver's door and bolted. I ran, gasping, panicking, not stopping until I was back inside Dunkin' Donuts. I grabbed my phone and called 911, barely able to explain what had just happened. Through the large glass windows of the store, I saw him driving off in my car, disappearing down the street. The next few minutes were a blur. The police arrived, took my statement, and I filled out a report, my mind still reeling from what had just happened. A few hours later, I received news. The police discovered my car by the woods in an empty state, and no one was in it. But something felt off. Even after I got my car back, the image of him sitting silently in the passenger seat, his vacant expression, lingered in my mind. Who was he? Why had he chosen my car? Weeks had passed since that strange man entered my car, and every visit to Dunkin' Donuts filled me with discomfort. Today was no different. I stood in line, ordered my coffee, and tried to convince myself that everything would be fine, that he wouldn't come back. It was early evening when I grabbed my coffee and stepped outside. I scanned the area, my eyes instantly locking onto a familiar figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was him. This time, he didn't have that vacant look. Instead, he stood there, head tilted, grinning eerily and waving at me as if teasing. A chill ran down my spine. My heart raced in my chest as I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Somehow, he didn't chase after me. Instead, he casually opened the passenger door and sat back inside my car with that same blank expression. This time, he didn't drive away. He just sat there, staring at me through the windshield as if waiting for something. I began to call the police. They arrived within minutes. I stepped aside, watching them cautiously approach the vehicle. The man remained still. He sat there, his emotionless eyes fixed ahead, oblivious to the events unfolding around him. One of the officers commanded him to step out of the car. For a moment, it seemed like he ignored their orders. But then, he slowly turned his head, his expression oddly calm. He opened the door and stepped out of the car, raising his hands as if surrendering. A few hours later, I sat in the police station, recounting the incident as if it was the 100th time. My arm still throbbed with old bandages covering the cuts from the key. They told me he had been arrested, and after taking his fingerprints, they discovered he had a long history of mental illness. His records showed he had been in and out of psychiatric facilities for years, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His delusions had worsened over time, and it seemed he had fixated on me for reasons no one could explain. They said he saw things, heard voices screaming incoherently when there was nothing around. They believed he couldn't distinguish reality from fantasy. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was mixed with sadness. The man who had terrorized me was not just a criminal. He was sick. His mind had warped reality into something unrecognizable, and I had become part of that nightmare. As I left the police station, I couldn't shake the image of him sitting in my car, staring out the window, detached from the world. He had been arrested, and the officers assured me he would be taken back to a mental facility where he could receive the treatment he desperately needed. But the scars he left, both physical and mental, would take much longer to heal. I stood next to the car, hesitating to open the door, reluctant to sit in the driver's seat where everything had happened. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to unlock the door and get into the driver's seat. I started the engine and drove out of the parking lot, determined to move forward. After all, everything was finally over. Haunting on the midnight train, the town lay deep in the mountains, with old houses scattered about and streets filled with whispers of long-forgotten stories. One of those mysterious tales was about the midnight train. For many years, no one dared to board the train, but I was not like them. I was the kind of person who believed that fear was for those not seeking answers. On that cold winter night, I decided it was time to confront the truth myself. I arrived at the train station just before midnight. The platform was empty, the old wooden benches creaking under the weight of the cold wind. Flickering lights cast strange shadows. The ticket counter was manned by an elderly station master, his eyes glancing at me with a mix of concern and pity.
"Are you sure about this, son?"
I nodded, smiling confidently at him. "It's just a train ride. I'll be back." The station master sighed and handed me the ticket. I caught a glimpse of him muttering a small prayer as I walked toward the platform. The slow minutes dragged on as I waited. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the town was holding its breath. Then, in the distance, I heard the whistle of a train, its headlights slicing through the darkness like two eerie eyes. The train stopped before me, its peeling black paint and dirty, soulless windows. The door creaked open, inviting me inside. I hesitated for a moment, but then took a deep breath and stepped inside. The flickering lights cast long shadows across the old seats. The air was thick with dust and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. A feeling unnatural. As I walked down the aisle, I realized the train was empty. No passengers, no ticket collector, no signs of life. Strangely, I wasn't scared. Instead, I felt a thrill. I sat by the window, watching the small town fade away into the distance. At first, everything seemed fine. The train accelerated, speeding through the night, but after what felt like hours, I noticed something was off. The darkness outside the window was unusual, like a void. I glanced at the clock, only to see the hands frozen in place. A sense of unease washed over me. The light above me flickered violently before plunging the train into complete darkness. I held my breath. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use it as a flashlight. But when I pressed the screen, it remained black, completely unresponsive. Panic set in. Suddenly, I heard it, a whisper.
"Jacob."
My heart skipped a beat. I froze, trying to listen. The voice was faint, barely above a breath, but it was there.
"Jacob, come to me."
I turned around, but the car was empty. The whispers grew louder, closer. I hurriedly stood up and stumbled, trying to find the ticket collector's car. When I reached the front, I found the car empty. Just an old, dusty uniform hanging on a hook. No one was there. The train shook violently, throwing me off balance. I clung to the seat to steady myself as the whole car seemed to tremble. The train was moving faster, dangerously fast. I reached for the control panel, hoping to stop the train, but it was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if it hadn't been used in years. My fingers fumbled over the switches, but nothing worked. Then the whispers returned, growing louder, filling the air around me.
"You can't escape, Jacob."
My blood ran cold. Those words seeped into my ears, chilling me to the bone. I turned to leave, but something held my feet in place. I looked down and saw an old pair of shoes still attached to a ghostly figure. It was pale, translucent, its face twisted in pain. Its hollow eyes stared at me. Then, more appeared. Ghostly figures emerged from the darkness, their bodies flickering like dying candles. They reached out to me, their cold, damp hands, their voices filled with sorrow.
Help us. Save us.
I tried to back away, but the shadowy figures closed in on me. Their icy hands brushed against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. Desperate, I pushed them away, their cries echoing in my ears. I needed to escape now. At the back of the train, I found a locked door leading outside. I pounded on it, shouting, but it wouldn't budge. Then, in the corner of the car, I noticed a faint light. I knelt down and lifted a loose floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was an old, dust-covered journal. The journal belonged to the original train conductor. He described strange occurrences and ghosts. His final entry spoke of a curse, a train cursed to hold the souls of the dead on board, and there was only one way to break it, by confronting the source of the haunting and seeking out the mirror in the car to destroy it. Determined, I followed through to the back of the train. At the rear, I found a large, cracked mirror. Its surface shimmered with a strange energy. Looking into it, I saw the faces of trapped souls reflected in the glass, their eyes filled with sorrow. Its shape shifted and swirled. Terror engulfed me, but I couldn't let it win. I searched for something to break it, as if someone were hiding everything to stop me from doing this. I decided not to wait, reaching out with trembling hands, and punched the cold glass. The figure screamed a piercing scream as the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. The ghastly shadows around me began to fade, their faces peaceful as they were finally free. The train also started to slow down. I staggered onto the platform, my heart still racing, my body aching from the ordeal. The town, now bathed in the gentle light of dawn, returned to its quiet state. As I looked back at the train, it was now just an old locomotive. The station master was waiting for me on the platform, a pleasant smile of relief understanding what I had accomplished as he left. I nodded, too exhausted to speak, but grateful to be alive. I had freed the trapped souls on the midnight train, and I knew I would never forget the terror I had faced. The midnight train had become legend, but the memory of that night would stay with me forever. Weird night at school. I work the night shift as a janitor at a local school. This job is ideal for anyone who enjoys solitude. It's just me, the empty school, and my mop bucket. I only talk to my coworker when it's absolutely necessary. Most of the time, we split the school and don't see each other during the entire shift. One night, the whole school was completely silent. The only sound was the occasional echo of my mop hitting the floor. I've done this thousands of times, but something about this night felt different, like something was watching me from the darkness. I brushed it off and continued cleaning, walking through each hallway. I wore my headphones, playing music softly enough to still hear if someone was around, but everything seemed normal. I took a short break to change the water in my mop bucket. When I came back, I noticed something strange. The wet floor sign I had set up earlier was knocked over. I sighed and went to pick it up, but that's when I saw them small, wet footprints leading away from the sign and down the hallway. I followed the footprints down the hallway, leading to the stairs up to the second floor. The footprints stopped at the top of the stairs. I paused, trying to hear anything. Then, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was fast, a flash of movement at the end of the hall. My pulse quickened, and I hurried to the end of the hall, but no one was there. Just then, I heard faint laughter, like the giggle of a child. It echoed through the empty school, sending chills down my spine. I turned around, looking for the source of the laughter, but saw no one. A loud crash suddenly broke the silence. The sound came from the first floor. My mop bucket, which I had just filled with clean water, was tipped over, spilling water all over the floor. My blood boiled with frustration. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't in the mood for games. I grabbed a dry mop and started cleaning up. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was going on. Were there still students in the building, or had someone snuck in after hours? I decided to talk to my coworker. Maybe she had seen something too. She laughed and told me I was messing with her. She looked at me, completely confused, shaking her head. I've been here the whole time. I couldn't make sense of it. I left her station, more confused than ever, and went back to work. Another hour passed. I was trying to make up for lost time when, without warning, the entire school went dark. For a moment, I was surrounded by darkness. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. It was unsettling, like the entire building had turned into the set of a horror movie. I knew where the electrical room was, and since I had the keys, I decided to head there to fix the lights. But before I could get there, I heard a scream. My coworker's scream, filled with fear, echoed through the school. I ran toward the electrical room, fear rising inside me. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. My heart pounded in my chest. When I pushed the door open, expecting to see my coworker inside, instead, there was a figure standing in the darkness. I couldn't make out who it was, but something was wrong. My blood ran cold as the figure moved closer, its movements unnatural, almost jerky. I reached for my phone, but before I could pull it out of my pocket, the figure lunged forward and slammed the door in my face. Panic overwhelmed me. I staggered back. I had to get out of there. I ran, my legs moving faster than ever. I needed to find my coworker. When I reached her area, her mop bucket was lying in the middle of the hallway, but she was gone, no sign of her. I called out her name, but there was no reply. The only sound was that faint laughter again, echoing through the empty hallway. The whispering froze me in place, my heart pounding in my chest. I quickly turned around, gripping the mop handle tightly, ready to defend myself. I started walking again, my steps slow and cautious, my senses on high alert. This wasn't just a prank. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. I went up to the second floor, where I had heard the laughter earlier. As I ventured further down the second floor hallway, I noticed something strange. The wet footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, were back. I froze, staring at the small, wet prints that seemed to be coming toward me. I ducked into the nearest classroom, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. That's when I saw the blackboard. Written in large, jagged letters were the words, "Hello." I hadn't seen that before. Someone had been in here, but I hadn't heard anyone enter. Suddenly, I heard the door rattling. Something was trying to get in. The doorknob twisted hard, and the door shook as if someone or something was pounding on it. I backed away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. The banging stopped. Silence returned, but the tension in the air remained. I slowly crept toward the door, pressing my ear against it. Nothing. I reached for the doorknob, turning it as gently as I could. I cracked the door open just a little and peeked out into the hallway. I cautiously stepped out, looking around for any sign of movement. I had to find my coworker. I couldn't stay in this school alone any longer. I started walking down, and just then, from where I stood, I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, just stood there, a dark figure faintly illuminated by the red emergency lights. I squinted, trying to make out the shape. It was small, like a child. As I got closer, I could see more clearly a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing with his back to me, wearing a torn school uniform. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, are you okay?" The boy didn't respond. I took another step, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. The boy's face was a grotesque mask, pale, soulless eyes, blood dripping from his nose, and a wide, twisted grin. My heart nearly stopped. The child let out a piercing scream that echoed through the staircase, a sound so shrill it felt like it was tearing through my skull. I stumbled back, dropping the mop. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to run. I sprinted down the hallway, gasping for breath. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly in a horrific way. I burst through the double doors into the gymnasium, slamming them shut behind me. The gym was pitch black. I backed away from the door, my body shaking with fear. The footsteps stopped. The doors stayed closed. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, from the far corner of the gym, I heard a ball bouncing. There, in the far corner, the boy stood, his face still twisted in that grotesque grin, holding a basketball and slowly bouncing it on the floor. Then the boy whispered, "Hello," his voice echoing in the empty space of the gymnasium. I backed away, my legs trembling. The child took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, as if he was savoring the fear he was causing. I didn't think anymore. I bolted, running as fast as I could toward the parking lot. My legs felt like they could give out at any moment, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the school. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw the child standing there, staring down at me with that twisted grin. I floored the gas and sped out of the parking lot. The image of that child burned into my mind. I didn't go back the next night. I never went back there again. The girl in the red dress. The house we moved into after my father's death wasn't anything special, just another old, quiet mansion in the suburbs, far removed from our old life. It had been abandoned for a while, and it was clear why the rent was suspiciously cheap. Overgrown grass and neglected old furniture gave it a forgotten feel. But to my mother, it was home. I was 20 years old, and I dealt with my grief in my own way. Not long after we moved in, I began noticing small things slowly emerging in the house. But the sounds of whispers, creaking noises made me uneasy and anxious living there. It started with scratching, soft, persistent, on the other side of my bathroom door. At first, I ignored it, hoping it was just my imagination. But night after night, the sound continued. Then came the knocking, sometimes at the front door, sometimes at the window. It always came around midnight, but no one could possibly be there. We kept the gate locked, and no one could enter the yard. Yet the knocking continued. I told my mother. She dismissed it, saying, "It's just an old house." But I knew the house wasn't just old, it was holding on to something. One night, I invited my friend Joe to stay over. We were sitting in my room talking about school when we heard voices coming from the kitchen. It was well past midnight. Everyone should have been asleep. Out of curiosity, we pressed our ears against the door. A conversation was happening just outside, but we couldn't make out a single word. We tiptoed into the hallway, but the kitchen was empty, dark, cold. We checked the entire house, nothing. Everyone was asleep. The voices were gone, leaving only a chilling silence. A few weeks later, my brother decided to test his luck. He and his friends thought it would be fun to play with a Ouija board in my room while I was away. They thought it was just a silly, superstitious game. At first, nothing happened. They laughed awkwardly, asking questions but receiving no response. Then one of them froze. His face turned pale, his body stiff like a statue. Without a word, he bolted from the room, his friends close behind, terror in their eyes. Once outside, the guy finally spoke. He had seen her, a girl, standing at the bathroom door, wearing a red dress, her hand on the knob, staring at them. He said she couldn't have been older than 13, and her eyes were filled with something he couldn't describe. Fear, anger, curiosity. When my brother told me this, I thought he was just trying to scare me. Of course, I didn't believe him. Why would I? I had never seen her. But the story haunted me, lodged deep in my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. Later, I had a birthday party at a friend's house. Jordan, a friend of mine, got drunk, so I took him to my room and told him to stay there until he sobered up. He collapsed onto the bed and fell asleep. Later, I went to check on him. The room was pitch black, with only a faint light coming from the bathroom. Jordan wasn't in bed. He was sitting at the bathroom door, one leg in, one leg out, talking to no one. I tapped his shoulder. He jumped, then looked at me, confused. He glanced back at the bathroom, then at me again. He mumbled, "I thought I was talking to you, but I just laughed it off, thinking he was too drunk." The next day, he explained, I was teasing him, but he was dead serious. In his drunken state, he had seen a girl in the bathroom. She was wearing a red dress, standing in the middle of the bathroom, asking why he was there. And when I walked in, she disappeared. It didn't stop there. The hauntings, the knocking, the voices continued. My fear grew as one by one. People close to me began talking about an entity that I had never seen in this house. I left my room and went to talk to my mother. While we were on vacation, my aunt and uncle stayed at the house. When we returned, they were sleeping on the living room floor, terror etched across their faces. They said the shower in my room kept turning on by itself, and the radio too, making it impossible for them to stay inside. My mother had no choice but to confront the landlady, who initially denied everything. But the truth came out. The landlady's mother had lived in this house as a teenager with her twin sister, who had ended her life in the bathroom wearing a red dress. It was all true. The red dress, the girl, the spirit trapped within the walls of our home. I didn't know how I was going to convince my mother to leave, but since we were struggling financially, it was piling up, so I had no choice but to stay in the house a little longer. The girl in the red dress. The days that followed were tense, filled with a thick sense of unease that blanketed the house. My mother decided we should move out and find a new place to live. However, things weren't settled yet, and we faced difficulties. So we had to stay in the house a little longer to figure things out. That was our last night in the house. I couldn't sleep. The woman in the red dress kept lingering, haunting my mind. I lay in bed, wrestling with these thoughts until I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see the house one last time. I got out of bed and walked through the dark hallway. I headed to the bathroom, where it all began. As I reached the bathroom, a chill filled the air, heavy with tension. I hesitated at the doorway, feeling something preventing me from turning on the light. I stepped inside, the cold tiles pressing against my feet, and then I felt another presence in the room. Fear gripped me tightly. Her presence was so strong, I could feel her breath on the back of my neck. I didn't dare turn around, didn't dare move. As I stood in the darkness of the bathroom, a cold hand rested on my shoulder, and a flood of images of the girl in the red dress filled my mind. It was as if she was showing me her story, buried for decades, The girl, now known to me as Maria, had lived in this house long ago. She was intelligent and talented, but her life was full of suffering because her twin sister was always more favored for her beauty. Everything about Maria seemed overshadowed by her sister. As the years passed, she felt trapped in her own home, living in her sister's shadow, who seemed to have everything Maria longed for. The breaking point came when her sister fell in love with a man. They planned to marry, with their parents' blessing. But Maria, who had quietly loved the same man, was devastated. Even her own chance at happiness was taken from her. Unable to bear the pain, Maria spent much of her time in the small bathroom. It became her sanctuary, the only place where she could escape the suffocating presence of her sister and the life she felt was never meant for her. One night, overwhelmed by sorrow and loneliness, she made a tragic decision. She thought that leaving this world would make things better, and she ended her life in that very bathroom. Her sister, consumed by guilt, left the house in grief, but Maria's spirit remained bound to the house, trapped in the place where she had taken her own life. As the images faded, I understood the profound despair of Maria. Her spirit had lingered all these years, waiting for someone to recognize her pain. But now, as I stood there in the bathroom, I felt a strange connection with her. The sorrow that had once filled the room was replaced with an intense urge to help her find peace. I whispered, trembling, calling Maria's name. I told her, I understand what you've been through. You don't deserve to be so alone. I'll leave, and you don't need to stay here anymore. It's time to let go and find peace. In that moment, the cold hand on my shoulder lifted. The oppressive air slowly began to ease. For the first time since we moved in, it felt as if the house itself had released its hold on her after all this time. That night, I slept in my bed without fear, no knocking, scratching, or voices. Everything had disappeared. Perhaps she had finally left, freeing herself from the chains she had once forged. The next morning, as we packed the last of our belongings into the car, I looked back at the house one last time. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the old, stately mansion. As we drove away, I felt that Maria had found the peace she longed for. The house was just a house now, no longer haunted by the sorrow of the past. And though I know I will never return, I will always remember Maria, the poor girl in the red dress, who finally found the freedom she had been denied in life. The ghost of a mother in the forest. I was never someone who truly believed in ghosts. I always thought they were just products of imagination, created to explain the unexplainable. But everything changed when I was in that cursed forest. It was supposed to be a normal overnight trip, and quite an easy one. The locals whispered about the forest being haunted, but I didn't pay much attention to that. The road was rough, and the darkness grew thicker as I drove deeper into the forest. My headlights barely cut through the fog, so I had to be more careful. Then suddenly, she appeared. An old woman stood in the middle of the road, hunched over, her eyes fixed on me as I stopped. I honked, but she didn't seem to hear, so I opened the door and shouted for her to move so I could pass. She didn't react at all. Instead, she slowly turned, looked straight at me, and asked, "Have you seen my daughter?" She kept asking, her voice growing more desperate. Then suddenly walked away, sobbing, leaving me confused and shaking. In my mind, I tried to dismiss the encounter with the woman as I continued my journey, but her words kept echoing in my head, gnawing at my sanity. When I finally made it out of the forest at dawn, I stopped at a small grocery store. The shopkeeper was kind, and I chatted with him for a while. But as I looked out the window, I saw her again, standing at the edge of the forest, staring at me. Fear started to creep in, and that's when the shopkeeper told me about her. He said that she had lost her mind after a tragic accident and now wanders the forest, searching for her long-lost daughter. I dismissed the story again, thinking it was just a coincidence. That night, as I drove back through the forest, the rain started pouring down heavily, making the road more dangerous. But I kept going, just wanting to get out of there as quickly as possible. Then, through the rain, I saw another woman. But this time, she wasn't alone, and in her arms was a child who looked frail, almost lifeless. I intended to drive past. I hesitated, but my conscience wouldn't let me. I stopped and asked if they needed a ride. She looked pale, like she'd been out in the rain for too long. She nodded gratefully and climbed into my car with the child in her arms. I handed them a towel to dry off, and then she directed me to a hospital. When we arrived, she quietly thanked me before heading into the building. I sighed with relief, but as I was about to leave, I noticed something in the back of the car. It was the black umbrella she had been carrying. It was still in my car, and when I turned to look back at the hospital, I was almost paralyzed with what I saw. I looked away for just a few seconds, and when I looked back, they were gone. It was as if they had vanished into the rain. Feeling confused, I decided it was best to leave as soon as possible. As I neared home, the rain was still pouring, and the parking lot was quite far from my house, so I had to use the black umbrella left in my truck. However, I felt a bit hesitant to use it, remembering that it belonged to the woman and her son, but I had no other choice. As I was walking, a strong gust of wind almost tore the umbrella from my hand, and suddenly, a wooden beam came crashing down from above, about to fall on me. It could have killed me, but the umbrella somehow pulled me to the side, saving my life. Shaking, I realized the umbrella wasn't just an ordinary umbrella. Perhaps it was a gift the woman left behind to protect me. The next morning, I went back to the grocery store, determined to uncover the truth. The shopkeeper hesitated, but finally told me the whole story. The woman and her child were spirits, doomed to wander the forest after a tragic accident. She died trying to protect her son. It happened on a stormy night when she was shunned and refused help by passing travelers. Some even splashed her with mud. She used her body to shield the child, but unfortunately, she slipped and fell off a cliff. On rainy days, if drivers refused to give her a ride, she would mysteriously appear in their cars and haunt them. Feeling a deep sense of injustice, she continues to seek out and punish those who don't help them. The old woman, unable to bear the unbearable pain of losing her daughter and grandson, went mad shortly after. Since that horrific accident, the villagers have often seen her holding a black umbrella, muttering nonsense. With a heavy heart, I visited their graves, returned the umbrella, and expressed my gratitude. As I walked away, I knew my life had changed forever. I had encountered something beyond the realm of the living, and from that day on, I would never doubt their existence again. Blue flames. I live in a suburb where there aren't many opportunities for hiking or camping. I will go camping for the first time in a remote forest. I think it will be a perfect camping trip because the land is flat. At the end of the trail, there will be a small pond. I walked for about an hour, but was a bit disappointed as it was quite small and surrounded by mud. However, it was enough for me to experience lying on a boat in the midst of nature. Suddenly, a thick mist crept through the bushes, clinging to the ground like a living entity that looked like a zombie rising from a grave. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. The sound of birds chirping echoed back, strangely distorted, indescribable. After setting up the tent in a drier spot, I asked Tin to take a walk around the lake because I saw quite a lot of interesting things around here. I wandered over to the other side of the pond, and there wasn't really much there, so I tried to go deeper. I suddenly discovered a mound of earth that looked like something had been buried recently, and it gradually emitted a very unpleasant smell. I turned my back. The fog was thick, covering the ghostly road. Cold, suffocating silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. I started to head back to my camp, and by then, the sun was almost setting. I had a small lighter with me, so I used it to light a campfire and heat some food. I sat eating and chatting about everything with Tin. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise. I was confused, wondering if there was anyone else out here besides us. Maybe I had disturbed them? As the sun set, I noticed a light hovering across the pond. It was within the trees just outside the pond, but I had walked there an hour earlier and knew there was nothing there. Tin jokingly said it might be a will-o'-the-wisp and that I should be careful or it would take me away. We joked around and then acted like nothing happened. At night, occasionally, I glanced over at the pond a bit. I wasn't sure what to do, but an hour later into the night, I saw from the corner of my eye that the light began to fade, and suddenly, a blue light flickered in the air and then disappeared. I didn't dare call Tin because he would punch me. I stared into the dark forest, feeling empty again. For about 10 minutes, I waited for the light to turn back on, but it didn't appear. That gave me chills, but I figured I must have been seeing things or dreaming. The dense forest was shrouded in darkness when my friend and I were suddenly awakened by a howling sound. Lights started flickering in front of the camp. I thought they were fireflies, so I asked Tin to go see because you rarely see this in the city. Tin and I decided to go on an adventure together. I must say we were really brave despite being a bit scared. Going deeper, the path opened up to a small clearing, surrounded by spindly trees with arrows on them. We immediately followed. Suddenly it was a mound. The ground around it was bare, as if nothing dared to grow near it. I approached and saw an ancient stone ring full of moss half buried in the ground. The air is thick with unspeakable fear, as if the stones themselves hold the memory of horrors. The tiny lights began to gather, swirling around each other to form a magical circle. This light illuminated the ground, creating strange patterns. My curiosity began to rise as I moved closer to take a closer look. I couldn't see clearly, but somewhere from under the mound of earth, something that looked like a horribly rotten hand like in those zombie movies emerged from the ground. Then the blue flames began to fly out rapidly like evil fireflies wanting to eat us, causing us to panic and not be able to run in time until we fell covered in mud. We started to panic. I screamed and waved a stick around instinctively, but Tin, being braver, took out his phone to take pictures. Moments later, we mysteriously lost consciousness and woke up near our tent. When I looked around, the blue light had vanished, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling and the distant hooting of an owl. Tin, he took out his phone to check. The photos no longer seemed like a spiritual phenomenon. Just as dawn was breaking, we were too terrified and quickly left the forest, praying as we hurried away and vowing never to return. When I got back, I researched and found out that the forest was cursed with an ancient spell, which is why few people visit. We had gone without knowing. It was fortunate that we were still alive. The Graveyard Shift. 15 years. That's how long I've been working the night shift at this cemetery, a place filled only with darkness and heavy silence. My shift starts at 11 p.m. and ends at 7 a.m. during a time when the rest of the world is asleep. Over the years, I've seen a lot, mainly teenagers causing trouble, or the occasional group of drunk people, but tonight was different. The night started like any other. I arrived early, had a brief chat with the daytime worker before he left. Then, it was on to the usual routine, a quick check. My only job was to drive the golf cart around occasionally, making sure everything was in order. Nothing happened, and tonight, nothing seemed to be happening either. I drove around several times before heading back to the security room for a break, which was right inside the cemetery grounds. Around 2 a.m., I decided to take another lap. As I reached the end of the yard, the headlights of the golf cart swept across the fence, hidden in the darkness. That's when I saw him, a figure standing by the fence. At first, it was just a shadow. I drove closer. Now, I could see it was a man standing outside the fence. His features were barely visible, obscured by the shadows. He was standing still, looking towards me. I didn't want to confront him, not yet, so I decided to circle the parking lot, hoping he'd be gone when I returned. But when I came back, he was gone. A deep sense of unease began to settle in. I got out of the cart, slowly, scanning the area again to make sure he hadn't snuck in. But everything seemed normal. Nothing was out of place. So I continued my patrol, passing through the entire yard, which took about 15 minutes. Sometimes I would slow down just to make the time go by faster. 15 minutes later, I got back in the cart and returned to the same spot. He was there again, but this time, he was inside the cemetery, standing on the gravel path. My heart raced as I drove closer, the gravel crunching under the tires. He didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, unnervingly still. I got out of the golf cart and started walking toward him. He looked like a man in his 40s, his clothes dirty and old. I stopped a few meters away from him and told him he wasn't allowed in here and that he should leave soon. I spoke, but he didn't respond or even turn his head to look at me. I reached out, intending to gently tap his shoulder, but the moment my hand touched him, he spun around to face me. His eyes filled with anger, and for a moment, I thought he might attack me. But instead, he turned and started walking, heading straight for the fence. I stood frozen, watching as he effortlessly walked through the fence and vanished into the darkness on the other side. Trembling, I got back in the golf cart and drove straight to the security office. I needed to calm down, to think. Once inside, I locked the door and tried to steady myself, trying to stay calm. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and then there was a loud knock at the door. I jumped, my heart racing. Another knock followed, this time more forceful. Panic set in. I had nowhere to go. My mind raced as I grabbed the landline and dialed 911. I explained what was happening, my eyes fixed on the door. The knocking continued, relentless, until it suddenly stopped. The next day, I sat with my manager as we reviewed the CCTV footage. The grainy black and white video played on a small screen, showing the man I had seen the night before. What I saw was horrifying. Just minutes after I entered, the man I had seen in the yard walked to the door. He stood there, motionless, for almost 15 minutes before he began pounding on the door. In his hand, he held something, but the footage wasn't clear enough to tell what it was. It looked like a metal rod or pipe. He was never identified, and I haven't seen him again since that night, but the memory of that night still lingers with me. Every time I drive past the cemetery, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, hoping he never appears again. Killer in the rain. It's late spring in a rural area with vast stretches of wilderness. My small house stands alone in the vast darkness, surrounded by trees, The type of isolation I always dreamed of before moving here. Here, I can live away from the noise, people, and stress of the city. But tonight, the silence feels different. Heavy rain has been pouring for days. I should have found this isolation peaceful, but tonight, it feels suffocating. I'm sitting on an old couch, watching TV, and listening to the rain pounding on the roof, a soothing sound that usually makes evenings pass peacefully. I enjoy staying home on rainy weekends like this, far away from the world. Around 6 or 7 in the evening, I suddenly heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. Another knock, this time louder. I hesitated. Visitors were rare here. It was strange for someone to show up without calling first. Grabbing a flashlight, I walked toward the door, my heart already starting to race. When I opened the door, heavy rain poured down, and the damp cold hit my face. Standing in the pouring rain was a man, soaked and shivering. He wasn't anyone I knew, just a stranger. He told me he was camping in the nearby woods and had run into trouble. He needed a place to stay, just for the night. His voice was pleading, but something about him made me uneasy. I handed him my phone to call for help so he could get a ride to town, as I didn't feel safe. But he refused, insisting he only needed shelter for the night. I felt uncomfortable, the rain pouring down on both of us. His insistence made me even more suspicious. I bluntly told him he couldn't stay here. After pausing for a moment, he turned and walked down the dirt path leading back to the woods. I watched him disappear into the trees, his figure fading into the rain. I locked the door immediately, still feeling uneasy. I tried to shake off the strange encounter, telling myself I did the right thing. There was no way to know if he was dangerous, especially in such a remote place. The rain kept falling, and I sat back down on the couch, trying to focus on the TV, but my mind kept drifting back to that knock at the door. After 2 hours, I noticed something, a faint orange light shining through the curtains at the back of the house. I haven't checked the window in a while, but now there's something outside. I stood up and pulled the curtain aside. Through the rain and mist, I saw it far off in the woods behind my house, a small flickering campfire beneath a tree. Despite the heavy rain, the fire was still burning. There was a figure in the rain, but I couldn't make it out. That uneasy feeling turned into fear. Could it be him again? Why had he returned? And what was he doing out there, just standing near my house in the pouring rain? I picked up the phone and called the police. I didn't care if it took them an hour to get here. I needed someone to ensure he was gone. After the call, I glanced out the window again. The fire was still burning, but the figure had vanished. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the front window and saw him, the man from earlier, walking by with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He was heading toward the house, toward me. I staggered toward the closet in the hallway, my hands shaking as I grabbed the handgun and rubber bullets. I had bought it for protection, but I never really thought I would need it. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I pressed myself against the wall, listening to the man pounding on the front door. This time it was harder, as if he was hitting it with the butt of his rifle. I had to do something. I couldn't let him in. I yelled that I had a gun and it called the police. I stood still, gun in hand, straining to hear any sign of movement. Moments stretched on, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, I looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. I cautiously stepped outside, gun still in hand, immediately drenched by the rain. I saw large footprints, caked in mud. He was probably gone, at least for now. About an hour later, the police arrived and searched the area with flashlights. When they got to the campfire, they found something I hadn't expected. A rough canvas bag, half buried in the mud, covered in wet earth. They dug it up and opened it. Inside, they found knives, zip ties, gloves, and rope. They told me it was likely a burglary kit, or worse. I never saw him again after that night. The police haven't found him yet. But they told me to be careful, to stay vigilant. Whoever he was, he had plans to come back, maybe even to kill me. Killer in the Rain. It's been half a year since that night. The memory of that encounter still haunts me. I thought time would ease the anxiety, that the man would fade from my mind just like he disappeared in the rain. But as the months passed, the fear grew more intense. What if he came back? Tonight, as the sun set, the rain returned, pouring heavily, just like that day. I was sitting in my usual spot on the sofa, watching TV despite my efforts. My attention wasn't on the screen. I kept glancing at the window all evening, unable to shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The sound cut through the rain, and my heart skipped a beat. Could it be happening again? I cautiously opened the door, but this time I was prepared. My hand resting on the pistol I had placed in the nearby drawer, ready for a moment like this. The porch was empty, except for the relentless sound of rain hitting the ground. But just as I was about to close the door, I noticed something. Footprints. Someone had been here, fresh and muddy, still sticking to the porch. I went back inside and locked the door. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining that I thought it was the same man who had tried to harm me years ago, and he was back. They said they'd send someone, but I had no idea how long it would take. For now, I was on my own. The rain continued, growing heavier by the minute, the wind picking up as well. I paced the living room, glancing out the window every so often. That's when I saw a flash of light deep in the woods. I realized I couldn't wait for the police to arrive. I had to confront him before he made his move. Panic welled up inside me, but this time, I reminded myself not to lose my composure. I grabbed a flashlight and my pistol, threw on a jacket, and headed out the back door. The rain drenched me the moment I stepped outside. I followed the flickering light deep into the woods. My flashlight cut slowly through the night as the muddy ground made every step feel heavy, not just from the mud, but from my hesitation to venture further. I continued on. As I ventured deeper, my steps became slower and more cautious. Then I crouched behind a tree to get a better look. It was him, unmistakable with the scar on his face. He was there, standing by the fire, his back to me. And in his hand was something different this time, not a rifle, but an axe. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain sizzled on the fire. I didn't know what he was doing, pacing back and forth, muttering to himself as if planning something. Suddenly, he stopped and turned toward my house. My house. He started walking, a strange smile spreading across his face. At first, he walked slowly, but then his pace quickened, the axe swinging in his hand as if he were preparing for a bloody hunt. He approached the house. I didn't have time to think he only had an axe after all. I pulled out my pistol and stepped out from behind the tree, shouting for him to stop, but he didn't stop. He kept walking, eyes fixed on my house, as if I weren't even there. I fired a warning shot into the air. The sharp sound cut through the rain and thunder. He stopped. For a moment, everything was still, as if the world itself held its breath. Then he turned to face me, cold, empty eyes and that twisted, horrifying smile. He raised the axe above his head. Before I could react, he charged. I fired twice. One shot missed, but the other hit his leg. He staggered, like a zombie, but still got up, the axe still raised. I shot again, this time hitting him in the shoulder. He He dropped the axe, collapsing to the ground with a pained scream, unable to bear it anymore. Rain poured down on both of us, the fire flickering wildly in the wind. I stood over him, the gun still aimed, my hands trembling, uncontrollably. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police were coming. They surrounded the man, disarmed him, and pulled him to his feet. He glared at me as they dragged him away, his eyes filled with hatred. I returned to my house, locking the door behind me, and collapsed onto the sofa. The rain continued outside, but it no longer felt suffocating. For the first time in a long while, I finally felt truly safe. Scary night at the toy store. The night sky was heavy, and the large parking lot outside a quiet toy store was dimly lit by a few sparse streetlights. The store was about to close, and Sana, a woman in her 30s, walked toward the entrance. She held a list tightly in her hand. Her daughter's 6th birthday was coming up soon. Inside, the store was nearly empty. Sana walked past shelves filled with toys. She felt excited as she picked up stuffed animals and birthday decorations. As she walked, she had the unsettling feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced over and saw a man at the end of the aisle. He wore a long black coat and had a hat pulled low over his face. He just stood there, staring at her. Sana immediately looked away, pretending not to notice, but she could feel his eyes burning into her. She grabbed the last item on her list and moved to a different aisle, hoping to shake the strange and uneasy feeling. For the next 15 minutes, she tried to continue shopping, moving through different parts of the store. She hurried through checkout, her nerves on edge. After paying, she headed for the exit. The parking lot was almost empty, except for her car and a suspicious gray SUV parked nearby. The vast emptiness made the SUV's proximity unsettling. As she neared her car, Sana's heart raced when she heard a car door open from the other side of the SUV. The man in the black coat emerged from around the SUV. It was the same man from the store. Her fear began to rise as she recognized him. She thought she needed to hide for a while. Sana hurried inside, her breath quickening. The store was nearly empty now, and the isolation was overwhelming. She moved through the aisles, trying to lose the man in the maze of shelves. Every few minutes, she glanced over her shoulder. The man was there, trailing her through the store. He kept his distance, but never let her out of his sight. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. She quickly dialed her husband, and when he answered, she whispered urgently into the phone. He promised he would be there in less than 10 minutes. The minutes felt like hours as she moved around the store, pretending to browse but always keeping an eye on the man. At one point, he seemed to lose interest and walked toward the exit, but as Sana neared the checkout counter, he lined up right behind her. The air felt stifling. She quickly moved through rows of stuffed animals and dolls, praying that the man wouldn't see her anymore. She crouched behind a shelf, pressing her back against it. She looked around, but didn't see him anywhere. For a moment, she dared to hope that he had really left. But then, the soft sound of footsteps on the floor shattered her illusion of safety. He rounded the corner, his figure looming larger as he got closer. Sana's back pressed against the shelf, and a row of dolls wobbled. She flinched in fear as one of them fell to the ground with a soft thud. The man stopped just a few feet away. She glanced, her eyes alert, watching his every move. This close, she could make out more details. His gloved hands, the lower part of his face visible beneath the brim of his hat. A faint, crooked smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He took another step toward her. He reached into his coat, and for a moment, Sana's heart stopped. Was he pulling out a weapon? What was he about to do? Suddenly, headlights swept across the parking lot as a car pulled in. Sana's husband had arrived, and his car stopped right in front of the toy store. The man glanced toward the lights, his expression stiffening, growing cautious. He stepped back into the shadows as Sana's husband drew closer. Sana saw her husband get out of the car. He walked toward the store, his eyes scanning the parking lot for her. She seized the moment and ran past the man, her heart pounding as she sprinted toward the store entrance. She didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes burning into her as she escaped. Sana rushed through the front door of the store, running toward her husband. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling, but she was safe. She collapsed into his arms, her breath coming in gasps as the fear that had overwhelmed her began to fade. Her husband looked past her, scanning the store for the man, but the parking lot had returned to its eerie calm. The man in the black coat had disappeared, melting into the shadows. Her husband gripped the steering wheel, ready to drive them home, but Sana couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Later that night, Sana's phone rang. It was a call from the local police station. The man had been caught. They wanted her to come in and give a statement. The man had been arrested just hours after leaving the parking lot. A patrol car had spotted his SUV parked suspiciously in another lot near a shopping mall. When the police approached him casually, he resisted arrest, acting erratically. Sana listened intently as the detective began revealing disturbing details that had come to light after his arrest. During questioning, the man, identified as Dennis, initially refused to cooperate. He claimed he was just shopping late and looking for lost car keys, but his story quickly unraveled. The police found disturbing evidence inside his SUV, items that made Sana's skin crawl. First, there was a knife, wrapped in cloth and hidden under the passenger seat. It wasn't an ordinary knife. The blade was worn, and the handle was smooth from years of use. Next to it was a set of duct tape, rope, and zip ties, all stashed in a small canvas bag. Dennis had likely planned something far worse than just following her. The real horror came when they found the photos. Many were of women, all taken from a distance, some in grocery stores, others as they left malls, a few while walking their dogs. And then Sana's breath caught in her throat. Scattered among the pictures were photos of her, some from the toy store that night, and many others taken before. They were taken when she dropped her daughter off at school, when she went grocery shopping, and even when she left her apartment. Realizing Dennis had been following her for days, maybe weeks, made her feel sick. As the investigation continued, more terrifying truths about Dennis emerged. He often stalked women, but none of his victims had ever filed charges. He was disturbingly careful, always skirting the edges of the law, always evading arrest or detection. 2 years earlier, in another town, Dennis had been investigated for the disappearance of a woman, though no evidence was ever found. The case had since gone cold. Sana was horrified to realize she could have easily become another cold case, another missing person, if her husband hadn't arrived in time that night. The police assured her Dennis would be locked up and no longer a threat. Sana and her husband left the police station. They drove home in the quiet darkness. She glanced over at her husband, grateful that he had arrived just in time. But deep down, a new sense of caution had been born. She would never let her guard down like that again. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in the faint glow of streetlights. It was 2 a.m. The store was closed, and the eerie quiet surrounded it. The night was still, until a soft tapping on the glass echoed in the darkness. I was the night shift manager here. Usually, things were calm, and nothing happened. It was just me, stocking shelves during the quiet hours while the outside world slept. I had been working non-stop since my shift began at 10 p.m., trying to get everything done. My focus was broken when I heard the faint tapping. It was coming from the front of the store. I left my cart, and headed toward the sound. Through the large glass windows, I saw him, a man. He was leaning against the glass, trying to peer inside. His clothes were tattered, his face expressionless, with a hollow, vacant look in his eyes. He saw me the moment I came into view. I approached the glass door. I asked him what he wanted. He demanded I open the door. His face was emotionless, no hint of a smile, just cold eyes staring at me. I told him the store was closed and that he couldn't be here. As I turned to walk away, a loud bang startled me. The man's fists were pounding on the glass, over and over, each strike louder and angrier than the last. My heart raced. This guy wasn't just a harmless drifter. I pulled out my phone, showing him I was ready to call the police. Only then did he back off, his eyes still locked on me, filled with rage. Slowly, he stepped back into the shadows of the parking lot. The tension in me eased slightly. He was gone. I put my phone away and tried to focus back on my work. 15 minutes passed. The tapping, the pounding, the man, all of it faded from my mind as I immersed myself in stocking the shelves. But then I heard it, the sound of metal breaking, like something being torn apart. I abandoned the stroller and ran forward, fear rising. My heart sank when I saw the glass door slightly open. The lock, the only thing that kept the door secure, was missing. Fear gripped me as I realized what this meant. I need to go to the office, call the police now. I turned to run for the office, but I froze in place. Standing not far from me, blocking my path, was the man. His expression hadn't changed, still cold, still lifeless, filled with rage. I don't think anything. I just run. I burst through the door, the man right behind me. Suddenly, a beat-up van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved dangerously, nearly hitting me as it stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. I moved forward, running past the van, but then everything flipped upside down. A sharp pain suddenly exploded at the back of my head. My body lurched forward as I fell to the ground. I didn't even have time to process what had happened before the world started fading. I felt hands grabbing me, roughly lifting me off the cold pavement. My vision blurred, darkness closing in, and the last thing I remembered was the roar of the van's engine and the sensation of being dragged inside. I woke up with a throbbing headache, my wrists tightly bound behind me. The van bounced and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. My mind was foggy, disoriented. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then it all came rushing back. I started to string it together. Man, the truck. Perhaps I was kidnapped by him. My heart raced as I realized I needed to act, and fast. I glanced around. Inside, it was pitch black, but I could make out a pile of old tools, a rusted toolbox, and some scattered metal pieces on the floor. I twisted my wrists, testing the ropes. They were tight, but I could feel a slight give, just enough to give me hope. I could hear the driver muttering to himself up front. His voice was low, angry. This wasn't over. I took a deep breath, calming the panic rising inside me. I needed to think, and I needed to get out. I inched closer to the toolbox, my fingers searching for anything sharp. It was hard, but I found a small, jagged piece of rusted metal. I awkwardly twisted my hands, rubbing the metal against the ropes. My heart pounded with every noise the van made, every bump in the road that might expose me, each one painful enough to make me want to scream. Suddenly, I felt the ropes loosen. A few more scratches and they snapped. My wrists were free, but I couldn't move too quickly. I glanced toward the front seat, where I could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't realized I was awake yet. I noticed the door latch wasn't locked. I needed a plan. The van slowed as it made a sharp turn onto a dirt road. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the back door open and jumped into the night. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my body as I tumbled over dirt and gravel. For a second, I thought I wouldn't be able to move, but adrenaline surged through me. I staggered to my feet, running into the thick darkness of the trees. Behind me, the van screeched to a stop. I heard the man shouting, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart hammering in my chest. The trees, the branches, scratched at my skin as I tore through the dense underbrush. My mind was foggy, teetering between fear and survival. I could hear the man crashing through the forest behind me, his breath heavy and furious. I couldn't let him catch me again. Ahead, I spotted a clearing and the faint glow of lights through the trees. A road. If I could get there fast, I'd be safe. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, waving my arms frantically as a car approached. The headlights blinded me, but I didn't care. I needed help. I ran into the middle of the road, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed against the hood, gasping for breath. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but I was too exhausted to answer. All I could do was whisper, "Help me." The driver pulled out his phone, calling the police. I glanced back at the man. He stood at the edge of the woods, staring at me with cold, furious eyes. But he didn't come any closer. He knew it was over. The flashing lights of police cars lit up the dark road. Officers surrounded the van. The man already in handcuffs not far away. His face was cold, blank, disturbingly empty. I sat on the curb, still trembling, wrapped in a blanket the police had given me. The world felt strange, like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. But I was grateful, lucky to be alive. I was free. The police assured me that he'd be locked away, that he wouldn't hurt anyone else. But the thought still lingered in my mind. What if I hadn't escaped? What if I hadn't been fast enough? As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I stood by the car, watching the police take the man away. The fear was still there, clinging to the edges of my mind, but I knew I had survived. I had been lucky to survive the night shift. Underground parking and mysterious people. I worked the night shift at an apartment complex downtown. The job seemed simple enough: monitor cameras, patrol, and ensure the building's security. The building was constructed in the late 60s, and its design left many vulnerable entry points in the parking garage. The association was concerned about security, especially with the occasional break-ins and homeless people finding shelter in the hidden corners of the basement. I had worked here for months, and every night I would check every nook and cranny. Most nights were quiet, normal, even boring. Until tonight. I walked through the dimly lit parking garage, my footsteps echoing. The place was a maze of dead spaces and blind spots. Too many places to hide. Too many areas the cameras couldn't see. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing only parked cars and empty spaces. I always hated the door that led to a dead-end hallway. It was an isolated corridor that led nowhere, just a locked door that couldn't be opened from the inside, as if it held some history better left unknown. As I approached the door, it was wide open. A cold wave of fear washed over me. The door was supposed to be locked tight. I swept my flashlight down the narrow hallway. There was nothing, just an empty glass bottle lying on the ground. My anxiety spiked. The thought of stepping into the hallway made me uneasy. I didn't want to get trapped in there, especially knowing the door locked from the outside. But procedure is procedure. I had to follow it, and I couldn't just leave the bottle there. Reluctantly, I stepped inside. I moved toward the bottle, my flashlight reflecting off the cold gray walls. Each step felt heavier than the last. I bent down, picked up the bottle, and stood up. But then, the sound that chilled me to the bone, the door slammed shut behind me. I rushed to the door, panic rising in my chest, and grabbed the handle. It was locked. I pounded on the metal door, screaming for help, but the thick concrete walls swallowed my cries. My heart raced as I realized no one was coming. It was 3 a.m. and I was trapped. I tried my phone, no signal. The thick walls and metal door blocked everything. I was completely cut off from the outside world. I leaned against the cold wall, trying to calm myself down. The flashlight was my only lifeline in the stifling darkness. I switched it off to save the battery, but I could still hear echoes from somewhere. Then the sound of car alarms blared, one after the other. Whoever had locked me in was out there, doing whatever they wanted, smashing car doors, stealing whatever they could. After what felt like hours, I heard footsteps. It was a miracle. Someone was out there, and I had to make them hear me. I pounded on the door with all my strength, shouting loudly. Finally, a deep, raspy voice answered from the other side, and after a moment, the lock clicked. The door opened, and I felt a wave of relief. A passerby, on their way to work early, had heard my banging. I thanked them profusely as I stumbled out of the hallway, my legs shaking, but my relief didn't last long. As I returned to the basement, chaos greeted me. Windows were shattered, glass littered the concrete floor. At least a dozen cars had been broken into, valuable items stolen. Whoever locked me in knew exactly what they were doing. They had silenced the alarms after each car was hit, leaving behind damage worth tens of thousands of dollars. My heart sank. I knew what was coming next. When the morning shift arrived and the residents discovered the theft, the police would be called, and I would be fired. Security had been breached under my watch, and though it wasn't my fault, I was the one held responsible. Weeks later, after I had quit, the mystery still haunted me. I replayed the events of that night over and over in my head. How did they know exactly where to trap me? How did they avoid the cameras so perfectly? No one was ever caught. The footage showed nothing, just me, doing my rounds. As I walked, I didn't see a thing. Maybe they knew the blind spots of the place too well. Months had passed, but tonight, that phone call pulled me back to the core of everything. I walked into the parking garage. I approached the dead-end hallway, my heart pounding harder with every step. The door was ajar, just like that night. I could feel the weight of the past pressing on me, daring me to confront it. There was something I missed before. I stood at the entrance, staring, then cautiously moved forward as my senses sharpened. This time, I was ready for whatever I might face. No more running. Then I saw him. It was probably the man who trapped me. His gaunt face was pale and dirty, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He stood still, almost like a statue, as if he had been waiting for me all this time. A chill ran down my spine. The man wasn't a ghost or a specter, he was real. My voice trembled as I spoke. "Who are you? Why did you do this?" The man didn't move at first, but then, slowly, a twisted smile spread across his face, growing wider. He started walking toward me. He started saying something I didn't understand, talking about how I would soon see for myself the secret of this place, the truth I had been afraid of and running from. He said he wasn't just some random drifter that night, and that he had been here much longer than I thought. This building, this place, it wasn't just concrete and steel. It was a prison, and people like him, they were trapped inside. For a moment, his expression darkened. He told me that there are things in this world that feed on fear and suffering. And places like this, they are where they hunt. Now, he was part of its cycle. My mind raced as I tried to understand what he was saying. The truth hit me. and I realized this man wasn't just some random criminal. He was a victim of something much darker, something that had taken hold of him and was now trying to take me too. I stepped back, my heart pounding. I'm not like you. I can still get out of this. His smile widened again, sinister and mocking. I turned, glancing at the door, thinking about running. I clenched my fists, took one last look at the man, then turned and sprinted toward the door. I could hear his laughter echoing behind me, filling the narrow hallway. I ran through the parking garage, then stopped. Standing there, in the darkness, was another figure, identical to the man in the hallway. I froze. This couldn't be happening. More figures appeared, stepping out from the shadows. Each one looked just like him, pale, gaunt. Maybe they weren't real, but they felt so real, their malicious energy surrounding me. I staggered. That man hadn't been lying. This place, this building, it was still alive. It had taken him, just as it had taken others before him. And now it was my turn. But I wasn't going to let that happen. With one last surge of strength, I got up and ran, not stopping until I was far away from the building, the figures fading into the night behind me. I didn't look back. Safe in my apartment, I sat in the dark, the truth of that night still sinking in. The man, the building. I had escaped, but deep down I knew it wouldn't be that simple. I needed to stay far away from that place and never go back. Abandoned house invaded. Behind my house, there is a large but old and decaying building. It no longer resembles a home. It now looks more like an abandoned house. It has been vacant for decades, or so my parents said. But every time I passed by, I would unmistakably hear the sound of electricity crackling from inside. It made no sense. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Finally, one day I decided to investigate. I asked my friend Tim to come with me after school. He agreed, though we both felt a tense, underlying dread as we stood in front of the house, a bad premonition hanging in the air. As soon as we pushed the door open, it creaked on its rusty hinges, filling the silence. Inside, the air was thick with an unbearable stench, a mix of mold and rot. Scattered across the floor were piles of old dog food, and the foul odor hit us in waves. We carefully stepped through the strange debris and noticed something odd. The floor was littered with nails, hundreds of them, along with animal traps, as if someone had deliberately tried to prevent people from walking through the house. We tiptoed through, avoiding the nails, our curiosity growing stronger with each step. Then we heard the sound of an electric charge, followed by a scream of pain from upstairs. It sent a shiver down my spine. We should have turned back, but our curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to climb the stairs. On the second floor, the noise led us to a closed door. From behind it, we heard a man's voice muttering something strange, as if giving commands. What was happening on the other side? Summoning our last bit of courage, we tiptoed up the stairs and peeked inside. The sight was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. It looked like someone had been chained up. Two people sat on the floor, appearing to be a couple who had been captured and imprisoned. Their eyes were wide open, filled with terror. A man stood before them, holding a stun gun, threatening them to follow his commands. For a moment, the room fell silent as the two people stared at us in disbelief. Their eyes pleaded for help, silently begging for mercy. Then their voices broke with desperation, sobbing and pleading not to be harmed. The man panicked, shouting at them to be quiet while violently beating them with the stun gun. But they continued screaming, their cries echoing through every corner of the room. Tim froze, paralyzed with fear, and accidentally knocked over a piece of wood, creating a loud noise. That was when the man noticed us. The man turned toward us, his eyes filled with rage. Without hesitation, he grabbed the stun gun and charged at us. We bolted down the stairs, but Tim wasn't fast enough. His screams echoed down the hallway as I heard the crackling of the stun gun. I didn't stop running until I was outside, my heart pounding in my chest. I called the police, barely able to get the words out, but I knew I couldn't leave Tim behind. I ran back into the house, trying to stay as quiet as possible, recalling the self-defense lessons I had learned at school. The door to the room was still open, and I peeked in. My blood ran cold. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The man was putting a collar around Tim's neck, his hands already bound tightly. I couldn't just stand there and watch my friend and these innocent people suffer like this. Rage surged through me, and I charged at the man, kicking him with all the strength I had. He staggered and fell, dropping the stun gun. I grabbed it, threatening him. Moments later, the police arrived and pulled me away from him. As the police began to untie the captives, they discovered something even more horrifying. Their feet had been glued to the floor with industrial adhesive. I was horrified that the man had gone to such lengths. Finally, the rescue team arrived, and the hostages were freed, though their condition was dire. They had been beaten, starved, and fed animal food. When the police interrogated the man, his chilling response was that he wanted to keep humans as pets. In the end, he was arrested and taken to prison. None of us ever spoke about that day again. This is a warning from what I witnessed. If you ever come across an abandoned house, no matter how strong your urge to explore, resist it. Stay away, because no one can guarantee you will make it out alive.